Hi, Kathy Mack here from Pink Chalk Studio. I'm in the studio today to share with you the faced binding technique that I like to use to finish my quilts. I shared this technique at a Tucson Modern Quilt Guild meeting, and it's been great to see how many quilting friends have incorporated the technique into their toolbox. They love it, and I know you will too. First, I'm going to do a little show and tell. Then I'll walk you through each step of the faced binding process. For wall quilts, we get to treat the binding as another design element. A traditional double fold binding is a great choice if you're looking for an aesthetic element to frame the quilt and hold all the elements together. In crosswise, the neutrality of the snow white background really benefits by having a container. I chose a multicolor binding that allows the eye to jump from the center of the quilt to the border and back again. Now I'm going to share some quilts with faced bindings. As I show each one, I'll point out why a faced binding was a good choice. In intersection number 1, the horizontal and vertical lines of the quilt move the eye off the edges in every direction. A framed binding would have interrupted that sense of an extended line. For night, I wanted the dark blue to convey a sense of limitlessness, similar to the night sky. The faced binding allows your mind to imagine that sense of infinity. Going to Town has all this intense color and shape going on in the center of the design. The borders create a place where the eye can rest as it exits the quilt. The faced binding allows the viewer to continue that story uninterrupted. I also want to point out a couple of technical construction aspects that faced bindings do really well. Faced bindings are a fantastic choice when the edges of the quilt have an organic line. These wavy edges are fabulous, and a faced binding shows off the curves. In Going to Town, there's also all of these structured horizontal lines across the edge. The curve along the edge creates another layer of visual interest in the quilt design. You'll also notice that the corners aren't square. A faced binding allows the corners to retain their fabulous wonky shape. So let's get started. So before we get started with the construction, I want to show what the final piece looks like after the binding is completed. And on the left, this is a corner from the front side, and then on the right hand side is a completed faced binding. And what you're going to see is a piece of fabric here at the corner, a strip that goes along the edge. This strip has been understitched to the seam allowance of the quilt. It's all been pressed and turned to the back of the quilt and hand stitched down to complete the process. And then this is what it looks like from the front side of the quilt. I'm going to measure the sides of the quilt. This one's 22 by 22. That's going to tell me what number of strips I need to cut to cover the entire perimeter of the quilt. From the binding fabric, we're going to cut strips that will cover the perimeter length of the quilt. And what I've got here is I've got 4 2-inch by 22-inch fabric strips. Those are going to go along the edge for the binding. And then I've got 2 6-inch by 6-inch squares. What I'm going to do next is cut these squares in half on the diagonal, creating 4 half square triangles. Now, one of the things I want to point out is if my quilt edge is less than 40 inches on a side, I like to cut a separate strip for each side. That avoids adding any kind of unnecessary seam to the back binding. If you have a quilt that measures more than 40 inches on any one of the sides, you're going to need to join multiple strips. And do that with a diagonal seam. And you'll see when we later in the construction process, when we flip it, a diagonal seam will create less bulk in the seam allowance, making for a smoother finish. I'm going to press under 1/4 inch along the diagonal ledge of the half square triangle, and I'm being really gentle with the iron as I press that down. Otherwise, you'll stretch out the cut edge of the fabric. I'm going to do the same thing on my strips. We're going to place the quilt face up on the cutting mat, and I'm going to position each half square triangle into the corners of the quilt. And we're going to work this one corner at a time, and we're going to move the half square triangle underneath and line it up so that you can see all the edges of the half square triangle. Then I'm going to take a rotary cutter and I'm going to follow the line created by the edge of my quilt, and I'm going to cut the edges of that half square triangle to match the line of the quilt's edge. And then we're going to bring that cut corner back to the top of our quilt, right sides together, and we're going to pin it at the edges. And I'm not going to pin it here because you're going to see in a minute we're going to bring the straight edge of the binding of the side and overlay it over this corner. And we're going to repeat this process for each corner of the quilt. And you can see as I cut these how wonky those corner edges actually are. And we're going to be able to retain all of that with the face binding. I'm going to place one of the 2-inch strips on the edge of the first edge of the quilt, and in terms of positioning, I'm going to position that 2-inch strip so that it extends just past the folded under edge of the corner triangle, and I'm going to pin that in place. And then I'm going to kind of follow along the curved edge of my quilt and add a few pins. As we sew this, I like to pull the pins out and allow that strip to just match up exactly with the curved line of the quilt edge. And what we're going to do now at the other end is we're going to trim this strip again so it extends about 1/4 inch past the folded under edge of the triangle. And what we'll do is we're going to repeat that for each edge of the quilt. Okay, we've got all 4 edges pinned in place, trimmed just past about 1/4 inch past the folded under edge of the corners. We're ready to go to the sewing machine. Now we're going to attach the binding to the back to the quilt using a 1/4 inch seam. And I'm just going to follow along that curve on the outer edge of my quilt. And we're going to do this all the way around the entire perimeter of the quilt top. And if you have a really curvy edge, you could pull your pins out and sort of guide the binding with one hand so that you're really following that curve. Sometimes it's difficult to pin that in place beforehand because of the way the curves navigate. And then I'm just going to push it down here. So what we're going to do next is what's called an understitch. And if you're a garment sewist, you're familiar with this technique. We are going to attach the binding fabric folded over to the seam allowance. And I like to stitch that about a 1/16 or an 1/8 of an inch away from that seam line. And what I'm doing is, if we think about it, the seam allowance underneath is 1/4 of an inch. So as long as you're less than 1/4 of an inch, you're going to catch the seam allowance with this. And the other part of this that I like to do is I like to kind of pull that fabric tight. And you'll see when we turn the binding to the back of the quilt, this understitch will assist in pulling all of this to the back. Just another way to secure that edge and give it a clean look from the front. So I'm back from the sewing machine, and what we've got is a look at how that understitching looks with the binding. Our corners are all sewn in place, the edge is all sewn in place. And what I'm going to share now is trick number 2, which is reducing bulk in the corners before we turn all of this to the back side of the quilt. What I'm going to do is, first I like to trim off the corner. And you don't want to trim so close that you potentially cause the fibers to fray after you turn it, but getting rid of that pointed part of the fabric will absolutely make for a neater corner. The other thing I'm doing is kind of coming in at an angle so that at this point we've tapered the fabric from the edge, kind of blunted the corner, so when we turn this, it's going to be a nice smooth edge. So trick number 3 is using a point turning tool. I'm not real big on gadgets, but my bamboo point turner is a must-have. This dull edge on the point allows me to gently push out that corner without poking through it. So I'm going to just gently push it in there. And again, that dull edge is just perfect. It allows me to have control over how much pressure I'm putting on the fabric to push it to the corner. And the goal is to have the combination of trimming away that fabric at the corner and using a point turning tool leaves me with just a beautiful square edge. Okay, the final step of binding this quilt is turning the facing to the back side of the quilt. And I like to use a steam iron to press along this edge. And we can see here how that understitching is helping guide the seam allowance to the back. It really creates a lovely edge on the quilt. And I'm going to go around the entire outside border, pressing as I go. As I'm doing this, the steam from the iron really loosens up the cotton fabric, which allows me to kind of use my fingers then to mold the edge. Now that we've got the binding pressed to the back of the quilt. I'm just going to add a few pins to keep it in place as I hand sew this binding to the quilt. And as you work around the quilt, you can kind of ease in any extra fabric. My corners, even though I was super gentle as I handled those half square triangles, you can see here where there's a little bit of excess fabric where that got stretched. So I'm just going to pin in place where I want it, and then when I go to hand sew, I'm just going to ease in that excess fabric. So we'll be back in a minute with a hand sewn binding. The faced binding has been turned to the back of the quilt, and I've hand stitched the binding to the back of the quilt. And the way that I like to do my stitching is I stitch all the straight edges all the way around, because I can stitch all the way into underneath where the half square triangle is. And then I come back on a second round and I stitch the triangle seam to the back of the quilt. And you can see here what I showed earlier, the triangle fabric was longer than that space on the back of the quilt. And you can kind of see where I eased in the excess fabric. The key thing when you're stitching down the corner triangles is to make sure that the edge of the triangle is locked down so that when the quilt turns over, you're not seeing any excess fabric sticking out the corner of the quilt. This quilt is just a great example of a faced binding and what it can do for a quilt. As you can see, we've preserved all the fabulous wonkiness of these shaped corners and the curved edge of the quilt. All of it just works beautifully together. Here's a look at our finished quilt. Wonky corners and curved edges preserved. The understitching gives the edges a lovely structure. The face binding really showcases this small quilt. I'm Kathy Mack. Thank you for joining me in this demonstration of a faced quilt binding. Till next time, happy sewing from Pink Chalk Studio.